Hello, everybody. My name is Mr. Geocon, and today is the 13th episode of the Geoconservative Files. Please ignore the very obnoxious sounds of construction in the background. I cannot control that at all, and I deeply apologize for it. Um, that said, I hope that more people will show up as the live stream progresses because today we have a very special guest. Uh, I'd like to introduce White Tom. Say hello, Tom.
Thank you for your stellar introduction. Hi, it's great to be here.
So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your YouTube channel, Tom?
All right. Well, I'm White Tom. The name is based on my profile picture, who is Thomas Wentworth, one of the earls in Stuart, England, who was sort of credited with promulgating and sort of instituting thorough government, like an absolutist project in England. And White Tom, obviously, because he's on the side of the angels, he's one of the good guys. And there was a parliamentarian general nicknamed Black Tom. So I thought the kind of dichotomy there was interesting. Anyway, I'm heavily inspired by neoreactionary thinkers, and I recently made a video criticizing Endeavour for what I saw as an inconsistency with his neoreactionary sort of persona and what he actually claimed to believe in his videos. So, yeah, a week ago, I made a video about that.
Fair enough. I'd like to ask you for one thing first. The name of your channel is capturing Gnon. If I'm pronouncing it correctly,
I think it's non how it's meant to be pronounced.
Capturing
sure.
Non. Yeah, capturing Non, spelled Gnon. What is Non?
Well, non is one of the terms that was created by the sort of neo-reactionary blogosphere back maybe half a decade ago. And it was basically a way for atheists and agnostics, the kind of sort of Silicon Valley techie types, nerdy libertarians who weren't very comfortable associating with Christianity or religious fundamentalism. They realized that the world was ordered according to fundamental principles, and that when for example, a Puritan might speak of the wrath of God in terms of the way that humans should act and how they would be punished by God for doing certain things. Neo-reactionaries like to try to find explanations for this sort of phenomena. So a lot of religion is recognized as adaptive in the sort of neo-reactionary canon. So the way that like an organized faith system exists to structure a society, give it self-belief and a direction, as well as maintaining in-group loyalty and high-group trust. This is like a fundamental principle that must be adhered to, otherwise you're contradicting the will of God. So it kind of acts like a secular version of God in terms of a punisher, in terms of a person or an entity who will enforce these fundamental principles, the everlasting laws of nature, stuff like don't kill your family, don't steal. These civilization building traits have to be enforced somehow. And obviously, without a god, you still shouldn't steal people in your society. This is like a rule. So none exists to sort of fill in the gap where some atheist thinkers weren't happy with putting God, but they would put their own creation, non, who is the reverse acronym of nature or nature's God. So the will of nature, will punish you for doing certain things, and it will support you for doing other things. Of course, it's a harsh like governor, right? But it's fair ultimately. And if you follow the rules, follow these principles, then your society will succeed. So capturing non is about the link between a kind of blind, unfeeling arbiter of justice within society and the human telos, how we want to advance ourselves, a human-based perspective. Of course, there are lots of systems in the world which might promote certain behaviors, like, for example, capitalism. One of the risks of capitalism is the kind of Aristotelian critique, which is profit for profit's sake. So no longer are you trading and bartering and producing in this system to benefit other people and to benefit society. Instead, you're making profit to expand your sort of commercial empire and make more profit. And in this way, you've created an unfeeling, like cold, completely emotionless, anti-human almost system, which directly contradicts civilizational principles. If you want to expand your empire, you fundamentally must compromise on certain things. Imagine you start out as a family business, and you're oriented within your larger community, and you hire people that you know, and you form relationships. To really expand your sort of commercial network, you have to go beyond the local, and you have to institute laws and rules and bureaucracy and institute these systems which are anti-human. Because the bigger you get as any sort of system, the less you can rely on people, because you're dealing with hundreds of customers, hundreds of employees a day. You might have a higher turnover rate, and you can't assure the individual loyalty of everyone that you're managing. So you have to institute these systems. And this is only the beginning, right? As you get into sort of later stage capitalism, you have these corporations that exist purely to make profit. One of a good example of these is something like Twitch, which doesn't really produce anything for society, but it just enables people to make money off other people giving them money. And somehow this kind of exists in perpetuity because there's like a demand for it. But the demand, it exists, but it doesn't necessarily it doesn't produce anything, right? So you have this organization which is filling this niche, and this niche is enabled because people aren't working as hard as they used to, or at least in the spare time that they have, they're not spending it like playing outside, or they're not reading books or raising their children. They're watching Twitch instead. So there is this niche, and Twitch will do everything in its power to promote this niche and promote the behaviors that will lead to this kind of life without those responsibilities or those perhaps virtuous activities that we'd like to see. And as such, under capitalism, or certainly late stage capitalism, you have this incentive to undermine traditional principles, anything that stands in the way of profit. And this kind of existed earlier, with even in the sort of inchoate stages of capitalism, with the exploitation of the working class by sort of the industrial mercantile landowners. I think I read somewhere one of the causes of popular unrest in the French Revolution was because this previous sort of relationship between the noble and the peasant, the noblesse oblige, didn't exist between the new upcoming sort of thrifty landowner and the peasant class. So this detachment of principles of this kind of loyalty and this brotherhood, this connection between nations, was undermined for the purpose of profit, and that's fundamentally anti-civilizational, and it's anti-non, it's anti-nature. If you structure your society around these principles that select for sort of the abandonment of all social principles, of all cultural ties, you will be punished by God or punished by none, or one of these sort of judging entities, right? So that's capturing none essentially as a project, and that's the reason. Just sorry to drag on, but that's the reason why my online persona is like Tom, but the project is capturing none, because it's it is the civilizational project of aligning our conditions with what we want as humans.
That's actually very interesting, because it sounds like it's another atheistic take on what was traditionally called the natural law theory, where you'd have philosophers like St. Thomas look at the nature of humans, the nature of society, and try to understand the moral laws from the teleological functions these humans have inherent to them. For example, from Aquinas might say that take his I'll take an example from, because you mentioned capitalism. I'll take his critique of usury. Thomas Aquinas would have said that, the purpose of money is to be used and consumed, and usury, it goes against that. Usury, lending money for profit, goes against that, because because when you do that, you're treating money as if it is something that it's not supposed to be. Something that it's not supposed to be, which is which you're treating money as if it was a permanent object, like a house, rather than a consumable item like food. And so when you use money like that, it goes against the kind of logical structure of the social order, and starts undermining it, because that's not what. If you were going to use money like that, you should have designed it so that, with that in mind, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of like Tucker Carlson, or I think Andrew Yang. I'm not sure who said it. The kind of money or the economy should work for the people, not the other way around, right? That sort of principle.
Exactly. I think yeah, and I think those types of ideas. Those types of ideas harken back to an older notion of something called the common good, which is, Mencius Moldbug expresses with his idea when he quotes the Roman idea of the health of the people is the law, or something like that, which is to say that, we shouldn't just do what people want. We should do what is good for them in a real way.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that Mencius Moldbug has gradually changed his mind on, as he has become Curtis Yarvin, that we all know, instead of his pseudonym. Because originally his blog was far more libertarian than it was sort of neo-reactionary, as you come to understand it, the emphasis on order. And of course, he still had these principles, but after a while, I think maybe with a gentle introduction, he begins to focus more on mercantilism as a valid sort of political structure or economic structure. And he has these sorts of funny ideas where it's like, yeah, Misesian. I'm not sure how you say it. Either way,
Austrian,
libertarian.
just call it
Yeah, oh
Austrian.
yeah, Austrian economics can sort of tell you which is more economically efficient to have self-serve petrol stations, or as you say, gas stations, or have a, I don't know, 17-year-old college student work there and give it to you, but which is more fulfilling for society. So generally, this is one of the sort of observations that we can make about his thought, that gradually, as he sort of progressed and matured perhaps in his theory, he was more receptive to these sorts of ideas that weren't purely about profit. I think in a recent live stream, he called himself an archaeofuturist, and he referenced H.G. Wells's The Time Machine. I think that's what it's called. I haven't read the book, but it's sort of about the way it's like a sort of futuristic society in which people are completely incapable and powerless, and they rely on the system for everything. And he criticized this idea. It's like, yeah, this is kind of the process of modernity, right? More reliance on systems as opposed to individual responsibility. But we really need to sort of capture some kind of archaic spirit and blend it with a futuristic political model for optimum success, and to reduce the risk of, if something goes wrong, society just completely collapsing in a second, right?
I actually remember watching a video by this guy named Blackpill, a guy named Devin Stack, and he did a retrospective on two movie adaptations of this of that Time Machine movie. The first one that was adapted during the Cold War, and the other one adapted in the 21st century. The Cold War adaptation was basically a critique of the boomers, and it depicted the helpless people as these it depicted the helpless people that from the future as what are essentially these hippies that are completely useless because they're too busy focused on shallow things and not very intellectual, whereas the and because of that, they are prey to these carnivorous creatures, and they cannot resist them. But in the 21st century one, it's just like it's another thing where it's people of color versus the evil oppressors. I'm not kidding.
Right. What film is that? Did you say, or I missed it?
It was The Time Machine. It's The Time Machine. It's I don't remember the title of Devin Stack's video though.
Yeah, I haven't read it, but I'd like to at some point. I have it on my bookshelf.
Yeah, I mean, H.G. Wells is one of those figures because I think what he was. I mean, the guy was a progressive of his time. He was a Darwinist, a socialist. He was a socialist with pacifistic views, but he's also kind of a social Darwinist who had this kind of that kind of attitude. And the Time Machine, if I remember correctly, was supposed to written in 1895, and it was supposed to. I think it was supposed to represent it as, well, the helpless people are actually the capitalist class after they've been so dulled and soft. They've been so softened by not working that they have evolved into just useless childlike creatures. Whereas the proletariat class had evolved into these dark-skinned and underground-dwelling cannibals because they've been put to work for so long, and they prey on, and so they prey. And being in those dark factories, they become monsters that prey on those people. And I think it was his critique of, well, what would capitalism look like that 10,000 years in the future?
I mean, he's not wrong, especially for his time. There's this dichotomy between sort of rugged, empowered, salt of the earth kind of working communities that, had a sense of pride and discipline and self-worth. And then you have these capitalists who are, cushy, living in their, ivory towers, who are completely detached from the realities of the harsh world, right? So it's quite interesting. You see a lot, even in history, sort of academia, this idolization of the working class at that time, as not this kind of like sex work positive, like trans community or whatever these sort of neoliberals are trying to impute to it today, right? They're very much a more, conservative, strong and unified group, especially, of their time, what, the 1920s, whenever he was writing.
It's kind of it's kind of interesting because to transition into what I wanted to talk about, which is some of the criticisms that neo-reactionaries have received over the years, and we'll get to what your first video on the topic, Endeavor's criticisms and your responses to them. Though I recommend my audience to go and look at Capturing Gnon's first video if you haven't seen it already. Tom, I'm sure Tom did a lot, put a lot of effort into that, more effort than I do into my edited videos. I'm not.
It was like a 3 a.m. like burst of sporadic energy, pretty much. I mean,
here's the thing is, I'm not good at editing videos, but I can write a mean video essay. That's my thing.
Dude, yeah, I was so tired coming to editing it. I was like, do I put text prompts on there? Maybe episode 3 or 4, but no one's going to see this, right? No one's going to see this video, so I didn't really think to.
Yeah. But I mean, yeah, to transition from that, one of the criticisms I've seen from people, and you saw of Neoreaction, and the criticisms I'll bring up right now are from this one Catholic blogger who you guys probably never heard of, named Zippy Catholic. He's very negative on the topic of Neoreaction. And so the way he describes Neoreaction, he calls it a photo negative of Marxism. Because while Marxism is classical liberalism minus the capitalism, Neoreaction is just classical liberalism minus the liberalism. It takes capitalism as being written into the nature of things and says it cannot be critiqued at all.
That's one of my problems as well with Neoreaction. But one I think that a lot of Neoreactionaries don't really agree with, because Mencius Moldbug was very much influenced, as he sort of says, by the Austrian school. But have you seen the trichotomy of Neoreaction, the sort of ethno-nationalist, the not theosophists, the kind of like religious, cultural traditionalists, and the techno. Oh yeah,
I think it's called theonomists.
Oh yeah, that sounds not theosophist. That's completely different.
Theosophy is like a cult. Is like
like the weird sort of secret society or something, right?
Theonomists.
But you have the theonomists, the ethno-nationalists, and the techno-formalism, right? That sort of constitutes Neoreaction. But a lot of Neoreactionaries were not so keen on the techno-formalism. At least some of the popular bloggers. And this makes sense because Mencius Moldbug has a very specific style. He's very much couched in the vocabulary and the lingo and the perspective of Silicon Valley elite programmer, and he conveys that in his sort of most right wing of essays. He says that his values are fundamentally universalist, what he describes as universalism. Essentially progressivism. This genealogy from mainline descent of Protestant to sort of modern belief in equality and the rights of man and liberty, freedom, brotherhood, all that kind of stuff. And he says, look, if I could press a button that would implement universalist values everywhere, I would. And so this is very much antithetical to the conclusions that one might derive from Neoreaction, which is restoration of traditional values, a sort of hierarchical faith structure, a sort of social tapestry that very much engages people in society in terms of their position in the sort of hierarchy. So recently, Moldbug has spoken about the Tudor society and the way in which it was managed, and you have the guild system, and you have this religious configuration, and instead of this sort of free-flowing kind of atomized individualism that he supported very much when he was writing it, it seems like now he has taken on this idea that instead society should be more cohesive and more attached to each other in this hierarchical way. And I think a lot of people who were Neoreactionaries at the start and supported it very much agree with that view of society instead of the one that he proposes in his neo-cameralism, which is very much based on like a sort of systemic a system in which people can exist in without relationship to values or society or each other. You can leave at any time. It's no voice, free exit, right? The system is there in place so that people do not have an impact on the way things are governed. They're completely detached from power. All they can do is leave. And this is fine for a guy writing this who, if you don't know, Curtis Yarvin, I think his father was worked for the government, and he was schooled in Cyprus and then went to the USA, and he was moved up 2 years in school, so he was never quite belonged to a certain group of people that or a certain home. So this very much suits him, right? Someone who's constantly moving around. but for everyone else who has families and perhaps bonds to the land, the geography, their forebears, people aren't going to support this model so much. So uh, I think really the kind of like capitalist values of free market and individual liberty. Those are some of the values that Mencius Moldbug tries to accurately, or not accurately, but properly promote with an accurate model of the universe. He makes a good case for why democracy does not optimize for these individual freedoms, and instead his whole argument is actually we can secure this kind of more progressive view of the world simply by implementing some reactionary reform, and in that way we can guarantee our freedom to smoke pot and have gay sex and own rifles. Maybe they're cryptographically locked or whatever at the time being, but definitely he was very much influenced by this by his libertarian perspective. But I think generally he has moved away from it. Neoreaction has moved away from it, and that's a good thing.
I mean, you're the first person I think who has acknowledged that perhaps Mencius Moldbug, or Curtis Yarvin rather, has changed over the years, and I think that is something that I don't think a lot of NRX people have even been cognizant of. I don't think that a lot of NRX people are cognizant of the changes that Curtis Yarvin has undergone ideologically over the years. And I think that I don't even know if Curtis Yarvin has been explicit about what has changed in him over the years.
I think that there's still some extent to which he hasn't, and that turns people off a bit. If you think about the clear pill, Mencius Moldbug's writing style is very much detached. He constantly makes comparisons to like an alternate universe or a parallel universe in which everything on Earth is the same, but it's called different things. Like I think Plainland and WashCorp for the USA. Plainland is like the USA. And he kind of uses terms, just sort of like interjects them here and there, and is not consistent. He calls like progressivism crypto Calvinism, then ultra Calvinism. He very much does not have this kind of like stable rooted perspective. That's like maybe a bit too psychoanalysis. But generally, he does not speak like you would expect a reactionary to speak, sort of drenched in this kind of religious and fundamental language with sort of gravitas. He's very much a kind of like casual guy. So when he advocates for the clear pill, I think a lot of people are innately skeptical because, this guy doesn't have anything to lose by adopting the clear pill. It's not like he is sort of tied to the values, principles, like ethnically and socially that he was raised with and that he was born into, that a lot of people on the right stand to lose by adopting a kind of passive, impartial perspective on politics. Right? Don't get engaged, just wait. And while I think that Moldbug does present a good case or a decent case for the clear pill, I think people are right to be slightly skeptical of the objectivity of his claims. Right, you have to be able to contextualize it for the man that he is. But that's just one of his quirks that with any writer you'd have to put up with to get to the the gold, the diamonds in the rough.
All right, fair enough. I think what you said earlier about him using phrases and terms willy-nilly gets to one of Zippy Catholic's other critiques, that Neoreaction is nominalist and postmodern in how it's structured. Now, while Zippy Catholic is kind of hyperbolic, because I think that's the kind of person he is, he says this is what he has to say on the matter. So, nominalism, in case for anybody who doesn't know, is the idea that there is no meaningful universals or essences. So language is nothing but the arbitrary use of arbitrary names, and what words mean is exhaustively characterized by analyzing their function in communities. Meaning is verified by and is nothing but linguistic usage. It's essentially you when you're a nominalist, you don't believe that concepts there isn't really any concept that captures reality. What you do is, so whenever you say something, whenever you come up with a phrase, that is what that you invent the thing that you're describing. For example, there is no a nominalist would say there isn't really such a thing as blueness. There are just different things that resemble each other in a certain way, and then we invent the thing blue to talk about their resemblance. But these things that we call blue don't actually have anything in common with one another. And nominalism is actually at the core of modernity in a lot of ways. Nominalism, you can see how nominalism can lead to individualism and science and things like that. If you take it far enough, but it's also a universal acid in a way, because it kind of melts. It kind of leads to postmodernism. Whenever we see, he claims that the meaning of something is nothing but what is revealed by some verification procedure or functional manifestation. And Zippy Catholic says that we should suspect that some kind of nominalism is in play. It's a nominalist. Any ideology that claims to reject modernity but is nominalist isn't actually a rejection of modernity. It's sort of like an agree and amplify of modernity. And so when neo-reactionaries, and here I'm thinking of Moldbug's concept of idealisms and anti-idealisms, or for instance, the distributist and his concept of magical words. They come up with these kinds of anti-concepts, which are these things that don't mean anything and only exist to express emotional approval or disapproval. So things like racism being one such anti-concept. And this kind of destroys language because it supposes that an appeal to etymology is enough to dismiss the word and the entire concept of the word, if we are supposed to accept the nominalist presupposition that essence is brought into existence by the coining of a term. So I think this is what, and to sum up, Zippy says the proposal that torture, racism, misogyny, and even homophobia are anti-concepts is false. Even a term like homophobia, which is almost exclusively used as propaganda, that is, as a building block for telling lies, refers to a real thing with an essence. So, with that said, what would you have to say on something like that? I know I went on a bit for a bit, but what would your comments be on that? Is this a valid critique, or is he missing something?
I think that this is a legitimate critique, something that I have considered, but I really haven't read anything persuasive by an anti-nominalist. And definitely Gnon is a sort of postmodern nominalist construction because it undermines the essence of truth. Are you familiar with the intellectual dark web sort of discussion? Brett Weinstein and Jordan Peterson talking about truth, metaphorical truths versus literal truths.
No, I'm not.
Well, it's basically like the same thing, but really, Brett Weinstein, he sort of says, well, if you believe that, for example, porcupines can throw their quills, you'll be more likely to avoid them and avoid getting hurt. And so the fact that you behave as if this is a true principle means that the kind of danger of a porcupine is more truthfully existent, or exists in that way, whereas the truth, which is actually that porcupines do not throw their quills, is not adaptive. It's unhelpful. It doesn't serve its purpose. So when you're looking at vocabulary in terms of their purposes, this is sort of the conclusion that you come to, and I find this quite convincing. I mean, I'm open to my mind being changed, but I think there was a writer of the French Revolution, and he spoke of the language of the revolutionaries, and he said, "Never before have I seen such a sort of desecration of our language." He sort of said that the way that things were going were evidence that they'd lost God's favor. But if we convert God to none, we instantly come across like a neo-reactionary perspective in which the Enlightenment ideals of truth and reason and logic are not these detached, abstract principles which language is supposed to formulate, but instead they are expressions of language as a speech act. And the reason that the language had been quote unquote sort of desecrated is because no longer, with the sort of system of formal institutions that existed, no longer did language represent reality. Instead, people were imposing their language, their will onto the world with their language. Their language was creating change. So it wasn't representing these abstract truths, and instead, when a revolutionary says "I am leader," he's not representing a sort of truthful statement that is describing with words which code information, right? He is sort of imposing with his will this state of affairs onto the world. So I find this a convincing model of looking at language. I think that Zippy Catholic is correct in this assumption, and that ultimately, abandoning this. I mean, this is one of the most common, one of the tensions of the sort of esoteric right. If you know Keith Woods, you'll know that he really disparages those who say, I'm gonna become a Catholic because it's the based and trad thing to do, right? There are certain as a sort of reactionary traditionalist, in terms of philosophy, he believes that this is useless, and that this is a capitulation to modernity, and that you need to establish these sort of abstract, universal, true things that exist outside of whether it's based in trad or helpful in some metrics.
I think part of the problem that you find is, I mean, there's a lot of different things that are there's a lot of different things. One thing that I would point out is that the view that you have that that you can impose your will onto reality, that in itself is a historically contingent view. So that is not universally true. So if it's under that framework, so it's kind of difficult to justify this as a general principle. I think it's fair to say that in modernity, people use language like this. But if you take the classical understanding of language, what is language? Well, language is supposed to convey truth. It's supposed to convey it's supposed to convey to another person the concepts that exists within your mind. It's basically a tool that we use in a similar way to how money is used to facilitate economic exchanges. Language is supposed to be for truth exchange, and so when you use it in the way that you do, when it has this kind of, it almost sounds like an aspirational element, really. When you're expressing in something that you're aspiring to do, as if it is reality, that there is a sort of dishonesty, or it's a kind of deception that's there, that can really mess people up. And it's not as though philosophers of the past were ignorant of these things. Like, you have people like St. Augustine talking about how language is inherently indeterminate, meaning that the words that there's no real reason why a given word it points to the concept that it does. That's just a historical accident. It's a historical accident that we call four-legged lagomorphs rabbits rather than yavagai. It's just the concept, but as long as we're using language to communicate truth, and then we can play with the language however is necessary. But I think the problem lies is that where moderns and neo-reactionaries too, when they play with language, they're not trying to play with language in order to get to a deeper truth. Rather, they're trying to do it for propagandistic efforts. They're trying to do it to, for example, they're trying to talk about the quill-throwing porcupines in order to prevent this collapse of society.
Yeah,
and,
completely.
That kind of noble lie. Again, the concept of the noble lie goes back to Plato. But if we're going to be espousing these kinds of noble lies, then are we really what are we even are we really going down the path of, like, do we really have any kind of moral leg to stand on if we're going down this path of we're going to be using moral lies these kinds of noble lies in order to preserve society? How does that? How are we really capturing the essence of nature if we can't express it? Why can't we just express Gnon in truthful language? Sometimes I think Moldbug got it right when he said that the truth is a very powerful thing indeed.
Yeah, but on the contrary, he did also say that nonsense is a more effective organizing principle than truth. So, I don't know where to stand on this issue personally. I think that I'm totally open to the idea that there is that we can return to that position if it ever did exist. But yeah, that would be a problem, I guess, for a Catholic, right? That our language isn't sort of couched in these fundamental principles, but that's not the way it seems to me, I guess.
Here's the thing, right? As long as you're using it to convey truth and not for something that I believe that you can play language games so long as you're doing it in order to convey truth and not doing it to say trick people into thinking that trick people into doing the right thing, because that's not. I mean, while there is something to, I honestly don't think that it's a good idea to tell the noble lie. I mean, it's a bit like this is one of my ideas on this, but it'd be like telling your kid that Santa Claus gives them presents for Christmas in order to make them good. I feel like it's kind of unnecessary, because it's kind of unnecessary and kind of harmful, because what could happen is when the child grows up and sees, oh, my parents lied to me about Santa Claus. What else have they been lying to me about? And then, just like that, your trust in that authority is undermined.
Yeah, maybe. I think that generally most people have a sort of intuitive understanding of the way that this works. People who lie to themselves, especially, can exist with themselves on that term, right? They don't like fall apart at the fact that they make their own principles. So I think that generally perhaps they could be reconciled in some way.
I see. I mean, if you want to know about, there's also another philosopher, Maimonides, who is a medieval Jewish philosopher, talked about the importance of real truths versus necessary truths. For instance, Maimonides held that because God is the way He is, God is what He is. He does not have emotions, because if God had emotions, then he would then that would mean he undergoes change, and then he wouldn't be God. But but he also wrote that it's important that the common folk believe that God does get angry, because even though God doesn't get angry the way we do, God does punish sinners. God does and is full of wrath towards evildoers. So he's not. Again, like I said, the idea that it is expressed within the neo-reactionary circles is definitely an old idea, but it's something that I think I think it's something that I think the problem is that we've sort of forgotten where the noble lie ends and where the truth begins in a lot of ways. And I think a part of that is due to the kind of breakdown in language that the destruction of these traditional institutions has caused.
I think one of the greatest benefits that we have today is that we can sort of clarify this distinction, perhaps, and work towards a new epistemology in terms of answering this question, because when telling the truth becomes kind of pariah, when you are not able to express yourself, you have nothing to gain. This increases trust between those people automatically. There's no barrier to entry. There's no free rider problem, because everyone who engages with us stands to lose. So you automatically have this process by which truth does accurately convey the way that things are, or language rather expresses language when expressed will express mutually intelligible understanding of things, and is not simply one person trying to exploit someone else. Because this is the problem that sort of leftists have. I forget who it was, but there was an actress who wanted to play like an LGBT role, so she had to go on Twitter and say, "I'm actually queer," and that took everyone by surprise, because she's telling us now, how convenient that now no one's going to complain that she's taking this role, right? But if your movement and ideology is completely ostracized from the mainstream, you don't need to do this, and you can, the fact that you're speaking the truth ultimately reveals your allegiance. So there's no need to doubt anyone, and in that way, that's one of the greatest benefits, because no one needs to sort of corrupt or use rhetoric to undermine the kind of essential structure and ideology of what we have here. We can, come to mutual understanding more effectively than pretty much anyone else on the internet.
Definitely. Oh, well, Name here says, so the opposition to the noble lie is not that it's a lie, but it is an effective long term. Well, here's the thing. There is no principled argument for the noble lie, right? People who advocate for the noble lie, people who understand, people who advocate for the necessity of this kind of noble lie, none of them make a principled argument. And so you can't really, so if you were to say to them, well, this is something that is that this is something that is wrong. It's wrong, always wrong to lie. A lot of them will just ignore you because they understand that it's wrong to lie. They just feel like this is a lesser evil that we need to take in order to take a greater evil. But I think you are getting onto something when you point out that that this kind of destroys ethical discourse, because ethics is no longer about what is good, but what is useful, which aren't the same thing. So good on you, Name, for taking that. I think if you want to oppose the idea of the a noble lie, the best way to do that is to establish you have to establish the necessity of always telling the truth from a moral standpoint, and that is something that's very. And I already did mention the ethical case for this earlier when I said that speech is meant for conveying truth, and therefore to misuse speech as you do is inherently goes against its function. So therefore, it is not. It is a bad thing to do that. Of course, the actual argument required needs to be expanded. Oh my gosh, we're getting to the hour mark. This is taking a lot longer than I thought it would.
Yeah, well, the conversation's been good, so I'm happy.
Oh, I'm happy too. We might extend this for a little longer than an hour, but I only have like a few more things, and then we can talk about what you thought was wrong with Endeavour in the summary, and then we can close. How's that?
Yeah, it works for me.
All right. So another thing that Neoreaction was accused of by Zippy, and this is his last critique, is that it's inherently anti-Christian. And he says in his regular hyperbolic language, blasphemy is the central tenet of Neoreaction. Because the central idea of Neoreaction, what Moldbug is most known for, is the idea that progressivism is a non-theistic Christian sect, and that if you don't understand progressivism in this way, you simply don't understand progressivism, period. So, and he quotes and one thing that Moldbug says, is that if there is one general weakness in the conservative strategy, it strikes me as this unwillingness to admit that liberalism is actually mainline Protestantism, which is actually Christianity. So, and Zippy would point to Christians like Distributist or Orrin McIntyre as being people who are filling the good role that good conservatives fill in all essentially modernist movements, adding respectability and preventing mistakes from being corrected. And he would conclude by saying, any movement that considers verbal games insinuating that Richard Dawkins is really a non-theistic Christian profound as some kind of big agree and amplify of Protestant heretics is either a dead end or worse, and it is certainly no place for serious Catholics. So what would you have to say to something like that?
Well, I think that the Distributist has, on a couple of occasions, agreed, or at least sort of provided his sort of commentary on this theory about mainline Protestantism eventually becoming progressivism. But mentions Moldbug, he does clarify this distinction between Catholics and Protestants. He refers to Catholicism in like the 16th century as based upon sort of order and ritual and hierarchy, whereas the Protestants were sort of introspective and focused more on a text and kind of equality of preachers and of the lay people. And okay, fundamentally, I think that NRX is not hostile to Catholics, but it is hostile to people who would propose reverting to a state of affairs that doesn't kind of rectify our problems. So, the type, like either, about the new atheists are a recent example, but also liberal nationalists, anyone who is advocating for democracy is too left wing for Mencius Moldbug. So, he criticized Larry Oster, who was one of his sort of formative influences, whose blog was called View from the Right. He says, Larry, 70 years ago, your blog would be called View from the Left, right? Because of your, promotion of populist values and this sort of thing. Social conservatism can only get us so far. So I think that generally Catholics are quite safe in Neoreaction, or at least there's no overt hostility. Perhaps there are discrepancies in terms of, how they view language, like you brought up. But generally, the history of progressivism as deriving from Protestantism, I find to be very compelling. I know that there are other theories that can explain the direction of American society or, Western society, and I think they have value. But definitely there are, one too many characteristics that have kind of filtered through the ages for it to be just a coincidence. Like in the English Civil War, you have lots of dissenter groups, levelers, diggers, ranters, Anabaptists, who emphasize the kind of equality of the sexes in terms of the Christian, like in terms of preaching and socially. The levelers, promoted the equality of man, the fundamental rights of people to sort of choose their rulers, and they wanted to redistribute property. They didn't, they thought that property rights are a perversion of kind of, God's intended plan for human society to work. So this sense of sort of brotherhood, this kind of like divine spark in each of us, which is a sort of Gnostic idea, really carries through into the American founding, or at least into the universities and the institutions. Harvard was founded as a sort of Puritan theological school, if I remember correctly, or at least they had a dominant institution that was made up of Puritans. And eventually the Transcendentalist movement and the Unitarian ideas grow from this kind of rejection of divine authority, or at least like kingly authority, natural rights of free subjects or free peoples, which is definitely inspired by Christianity, or at least is pushed very heavily by the early Protestants and the Puritans. James I, the English king before Charles I, who was beheaded, he was not raised, but he was tutored by George Buchanan, who was one of the sort of founding members of the Scottish Reformation, and he literally beat into James I this idea that people choose their governments, and that divine right monarchy is not legitimate under Christianity. And James rejected this idea, obviously, as you would. And so you do have this tradition, and it's hard to say, because you can do this with anything, right? You can go back and say, oh, well, the last 50 years after post-World War II, things went downhill. Oh, no, it was before that. It was with Abraham Lincoln, or it was, the American founding, or the Reformation, or, Christianity, and we should return to paganism. But fundamentally, you can basically tell by the 17th century who is who, where the sand, like the line of the sand has been drawn, the die is cast, and the diggers and the ranters and the Anabaptists and these radical sects who detach from mainstream sort of secular authority in the king and the sacred authority in the Church of England, they move to America and they establish their own utopian communities, and they're all basically inspired by sort of Protestant precedent, and they're all these sorts of utopian socialists, sort of equality, good shared in common, equal rights of everyone, of all the worshippers, of all the believers.
Well, I mean, I've heard one NRX guy call it the impetus to build God's kingdom on Earth.
Right, the millenarian aspect of it. I mean, yeah, definitely. There seems to be a slight disconnect. I mean, this is, going back to the argument we have of Christianity between the what God wants and the way that things are, which is more complex than it sounds. I don't want to mistake my theology because I'm not a theologian, but there are certain rules in Christianity that say that there is a sort of spiritual way that there is a spiritual importance to the way that things are, and that nature can contradict that. Like, for example, with the mandate of heaven in China, it's like the ruler has the mandate until they don't. There is no, everything that happens was God's law. It was the mandate of heaven that they were meant to lose it. So you have this kind of post hoc justification of anything that happens, which is sort of then spiritualized. Whereas in Christianity, the spirituality comes first, and the material realm and social organizations and politics must reflect the spiritual laws set out by God. I hope I made that clear. But yeah, so I kind of, I think this project of building God's kingdom on earth can be interpreted in any way, right? I think that's an aspect of Protestant theology and of modern progressivism, but it's really hard to say like how much.
Well,
that can be conservative or liberal, right?
Well, the thing about granted, if the Puritans were around today, they'd definitely be considered like hardline reactionaries, even though they share the idea of building God's kingdom on earth. What I would say about this kind of impetus is that the church, one thing that definitely separates more Orthodox faiths like the Catholic Church or the Orthodox or even the High Church, and even some of the High Church Protestants like Lutheran,
You've cut out, by the way. We seem to be having some technical issues here. I think Geocon's mic has disconnected or something. I'm not sure. Rip F in chat.
Constantine changed things.
Hang on. Your mic was off the entire time. I couldn't hear you. No one could hear you that entire time. Sorry.
Wait, what?
Yeah. For maybe about 45 seconds, I don't think we could hear you.
What? That's
I don't know.
That is very odd. That's never happened to me before. Well, that's okay.
Technical issues. Just go from the top.
Okay. So what I'd say is that the main difference between the kind of high church Christianity and Orthodox that you see in Anglicanism and Lutheranism, and then also the Orthodox Christianity with things like the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. And that's one side, and then on the other side you have these kinds of radical Reformation, these heresies that would show up, these kind of millenarian heresies that show up. The difference is that these millenarian heresies often proclaim that they are hearkening back to a primitive Christianity that existed before it was institutionalized. and that the essence of what Christianity is that it's that it's all about this kind of radical freedom from institutions, this anti-authoritarianism. And recently, just today, I made a tweet about this one author, Matt McManus, who is doing book reviews of Slavoj Žižek's newest book on Christianity, and he made this case that the left is fundamentally celebrate Christianity because it's a faith of radical freedom, absolute freedom. God is materialized in Christianity and becomes a human, and this is the highest expression of the world. We don't need any kind of teleological meaning. All we need is freedom. So that's that is the kind of Christianity that people are the people on the left believe in, whether they openly reject Christianity or embrace it. That's what that's sort of the kind of Christianity, that kind of non-theistic Protestantism that that you're talking about, I think. And from the Catholic point of view, we would just say that that's heresy. But I can understand someone like Moldbug when he says that it just is Christianity, because maybe you're not super theological, or if you're an atheist, you have no reason to get the theology right. I mean, Moldbug doesn't even believe in metaphysics at all.
No, he never really touches on metaphysics. And the idea that progressives owe a lot to Christianity is, I think, basically true. I mean, we've gone over this, but I'm not sure how much I would say God is a man. I know that Nietzsche makes this kind of point in Beyond Good and Evil, that God represents the ancestor spirit, and as society grows bigger, we tend towards monotheism, the placing of our fortunes within this one God who we owe so much to, and that Jesus represents the sacrifice. He represents like the fact that people in society are so disconnected from their empowerment. People kind of internalize this subordinate relationship to authority because of the way that society is structured in these more urban civilizations, and as such, we cannot fully atone for our sins, in the sense that all relationships are based upon the kind of disgust of the or not the disgust, but the way that the person on top of the hierarchy has authority of the person at the bottom in the hierarchy. The person on the bottom can never fully atone for this. They can never fully breach this or undermine this. So Jesus sort of steps in, and he atones for our sins almost, and allows us to ascend. And he engages in that sort of psychoanalytic way. But yeah, I think it's perfectly legitimate to be a Catholic and to just say, look, these Protestants are crazy, and look at the way that they've abandoned all the traditional tenets of Christianity, and how they justify everything in terms of sola scriptura. You can say, oh, look, here's where it says that transsexualism is allowed, and this and that and whatever. And when you look at those who historically have pushed for social progress, it has been Quakers, and it has been these radical leftist Christian sects who say, well, hell, do we really believe in that anymore? Isn't that kind of old? Everyone's good at heart, really, and God wants the best for all of us. You have this weird perversion of traditional Christianity, and I mean that's one of the key elements in trying to uncover this genealogy, is to what extent is this just people justifying their resistance to authority and hierarchy using Christianity, the kind of social fabric, to undermine this authority, right? Or whether it's actually, whether Christianity is actually, there's something in it, there's something essential in Christianity that results in this, at least. But just a final thing, I mean, definitely, regardless of these essential characteristics, you have with the Reformation this idea, this general social milieu in which the Catholics occupy the side of authority, hierarchy, and order, the relationship between the priest and the masses, whereas with the burgeoning Protestants in the 17th and 16th centuries, it's more detached. It's more about the individual's relationship to the scripture, and it's less about these traditional forms or these traditional forms of sort of hierarchy and social relation. And so, regardless of whether the metaphysical debates and the genealogies, this trend existed from the start. Catholics, some of them viscerally opposed the printing press because it would allow any old person, any old peasant, to open a Bible and interpret them for themselves. So that's like the fundamental that everyone can basically agree on, is that the Reformation was pretty terrible in terms of the advancement of tradition, of conservative values within the church and within society generally.
I have a hard time disagreeing with that, even if I have some Protestant friends who would push back on that. I think there is an element of truth in saying that the Reformation and some of the ideas that trickled down into the Reformation from earlier states in the church, earlier heresies, like William of Ockham's nominalist version of Catholicism. I think these. I think you found within the chaos of the Reformation era Europe, some of these kinds of radical tendencies pop up, and because because they weren't suppressed by the institutional order, out of I guess some of the people in power found these groups useful and promoted their ideas, and that's gradually led us to the modern day. So I think what to cover next would be like a little bit about your video in particular, because Endeavour pushes back on some of these things, particularly the crypto Calvinist or crypto Quaker narrative that Moldbug presents, and instead points to a different religious group, the Uden.
Yeah, well,
so what would you have to? Well, you can say what. You can be open about this here. We're not talking about the race. We're talking about the religion.
Yeah, it's one of those things in post-colonial history. There's a big debate on, there's like the traditional view, which is that civilization was created by white people and it's imposed on everyone else, and it's really good. And then you have these other theorists who say, actually no, it was made by white people, but it wasn't a good thing. And then you have these other people who say, actually, look at the ways, we're going to emphasize the voices of the marginalized, of the Jews and the blacks and the colonized peoples and the women. Here's how they contributed to the system, that we have today. And then you have these more radical people who say, no, the system is terrible. And actually, by trying to, involve Jews and whatever and women in the creation of it, you're undermining their struggle with, patriarchal Western colonial capitalism, imperialism, etc. So, here I just want to clarify, when I speak about Jewish influence on progressivism, I'm doing this very much in a way that I'm emphasizing their role in creating the modern world as we know and love it today. But I think, okay, yeah, definitely. There's a really good debate back and forth. I might link it at some point, between Kevin MacDonald and his name escapes me right now, the guy who wrote Eric Kaufman, and they discuss the rise and fall of Anglo-America and how much of that was to do with Jewish influence. But I think that is a legitimate argument. I think discussing that is important, and as anything is. But fundamentally, Neoreaction is not about setting the clock back 100 years or 70 years to to pre-World War II forms of government. Certainly, society has changed a lot since then, and but that's besides the point, because as neo-reactionaries, we understand that culture is downstream from politics. It's only people who believe in the fact that people are less moral today, and that's like the primary cause of our the collapse, not the collapse of our society, but as it decays currently. That's the reason for it, is because they don't understand the way in which politics has such an effect. And this is clear if someone like Charles I, when he tried to implement a policy of personal rule, he hired Thomas Wentworth, who was this kind of arch reactionary who went about centralizing government, and Archbishop Laud. Both of these people, Moldbug, says that he agrees with, and Archbishop Laud was try to reform the Church of England, or at least maintain its high church elements and return it to a more kind of grand, almost Catholic, and that's why he got so much pushback. But a sense of authority and deference to the priesthood, and grandiose beauty of religion is what he called it. So definitely, I think that there is if we just make the right political decisions, or at least have the right political structure, we will generally encourage the correct social and cultural values. I mean, that's clear to me. Another good example of this on the other side of the spectrum is communism. When a communist comes to power.
Please continue talking. I have to do something for a moment. I'll be right back, but I'll still be listening, but okay. I won't be able to respond.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll just continue monologuing. But under communism, you have a system of government in which things are not very well formalized or ordered in a certain way that is conducive to sort of more modern forms of social control. When Lenin came to power, he immediately tried to institute all of these social liberal reforms, such as confiscating all church property, ensuring the equality of the sexes, in terms of right to abort and to divorce, and women to own property, and he removed the hierarchy in the army. There was going to be democracy in the army. You would vote for your officers, and you wouldn't treat them any differently. You wouldn't salute. But of course, Russia is going through a civil war. So what happens is Trotsky takes over the army, and he captures all of the Tsarist generals, puts their family in prison, holds them hostage, and says, we'll kill your families if you don't fight for the Red Army. So I think something like 75% of communist generals, or Red Army generals, at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, or at least the Civil War, were ex-Tsarist officials. And of course, the military was instantly sort of de-democratized and was made strictly hierarchical, with political commissars attached to every unit to ensure ideological conformity, so that all of them were on board with communism to the extent that they could be, and B, personal loyalty. And this generally is the most crude form of social control. Not in a bad way. Obviously, there's a lot of merit to this. Not perhaps extreme as the methods that they used, but trying to assure personal loyalty by adherence to dogma and to ideology is very inefficient. And instead, in the modern day, there are tools that we can use to accomplish this, such as through sort of the economy and bureaucracy and the police, these institutions of law and order. I mean, it's impossible to imagine now a rebellion in the United States going as well as it could have possibly done, like it did in the American War of Independence. People generally are not so much at liberty to control their surroundings and affect their wider communities and assemble armies to resist authority. So generally, the political structure, so my point is with the communist comparison is that despite ideology, politics is the ultimate arbiter of what will essentially become social and cultural values. And it was fundamentally due to the weakness of the communists. They had to try to implement these social and cultural norms to try to retain any semblance of power. So that, what does that tell us? That tells us that our problems go back further than 70 years. Democracy is problematic for ensuring long-term, stable, cohesive values, because if you have a political party, it's directly in your interests to open the borders, import as many voters as you can to win an election. Get funding from your donors, and to win popular support, right?
Yeah, and I'd also like to add that mass ethnic slaughters of your own population were not really a thing before the age of democracy, because when you have, like, I'll give you an example of a country that you might not even that wasn't even a democracy. You have the Tsar, right? You have the Russian Tsars of the 19th century. So for about several centuries, the Tsardom was kept into the hands of a single ethnic group that had several different ethnic groups aligned with it. The Russian Tsars were so distant from the rest of the population that they didn't even speak the same language. They spoke French, not Russian. I learned this in my Russian history course back in college. What ended up happening, though, was one of the Tsars was greatly influenced by nationalist ideology, which is an inherently democratic ideology, I might add. And what they did, what he thought was, all right, well, we need to have a uniform country where everybody speaks the same language, everybody prays the exact same way, and we need this kind of absolute homogeneity. And what ended up happening was it not only failed in its implementation, but it also kind of destroyed the ethnic ties that the Russian Tsar had with the different ethnic groups that were loyal to the Tsar. Were alienated by this because they were essentially forced into being something that they forced into these roles that they were not used to. These kinds of, and this kind of drive towards homogeneity has been classically associated with democracy, and it sort of goes again. It's kind of odd to modern ears because in modern times, homogeneity is associated with the far right, with people like Donald Trump, or people like the alt-right or Donald Trump or whatever. They always talk about they just want this kind of either ideological homogeneity or this kind of ethnic homogeneity. But in fact, what I see with these kinds of things, with these kinds of democratic movements, is that there is this sort of drive towards this kind of absolute homogeneity within these groups, even with the whole diversity is our strength thing. They don't really want diversity in the they want diversity in the sense that everybody will put a progressive commissar into their HR departments. They don't want diversity as in Africans being Africans. Whenever you see a progressive talk about diversity, it's always like they seem to think that it's just they seem to think that the world is like Epcot, and the only Epcot from Disney, right?
I'm actually not familiar.
Well, in Disney World, there's a part of their park called Epcot that is considered to, and Epcot is supposed to be represent the dreams of the kind of a futurist dream made into an amusement park. And there's this one, and there's this one part um, that has a world tour type of thing, and they have a ride that where they sing "It's a Small World After All," and you can try out all of the different and you can experience all the different cultures of the world in the forms of cheap food and souvenirs that are themed after these different countries.
I mean, that's just like, the pinnacle of modern neoliberalism, right? Like total global spread of like certain things, but they're all the most boiled down versions of identity possible. Nothing actually substantive.
Yeah, exactly. It's nothing substantive. It's all boiled down into something that could fit inside an amusement park. And I think that's really what diversity ends up. They don't really care about it, and I think this kind of drive towards homogeneity that you see both on the alt right and in the progressive movement, in the form of their wanting this kind of ideological homogeneity in progressivism, is a symptom of democracy, I think, because in a democracy, you you have to get people to vote for you, and the easiest way to get people to vote for you is to exercise political power to get rid of the people who won't vote for you in one way or another.
Yeah, completely. And I think another problem, well, just going off from that, in the English Civil War, you have Charles I, who's just trying to mediate between between like the Puritans and everyone else, because the Puritans don't think the society is godly enough and adheres to their values enough, and they think that there are Catholics everywhere. There are Catholics in government. There are Catholics conspiring to overthrow the king. There are Catholics conspiring to invade. You have this kind of total paranoia that becomes a phenomenon, like a conspiracy theory. And there you have Charles I just trying to manage his people and ensure that effective governance. And this has been the same. This is the same thing ever since Parliament was allowed a voice. They were just totally pushing for these sort of exclusive kind of like what we would now consider as right wing positions, right? But they're really not. It's I think when in 1871, when universal male suffrage was established in Germany, political elites spoke of the brutalization of public opinion, and that's really when you get this sort of vicious anti-Semitism that exists in politics, because people are just trying to appeal to their local constituents and their sort of worst prejudices. And also, that's not to say that there aren't valid critiques of the way that Jews have acted in terms of undermining traditional values in the West. That's not the point. But there's a tendency for mobs, as pretty much everyone knew this up until the 20th century, to act irrationally with kind of hatred, bigotry, ignorance. Whereas someone who is a king or has undivided sovereignty is just trying to manage their estate effectively, and that's one of the greatest problems. And that's why you see this, as a society becomes more and more degraded in terms of political authority, you end up with something like Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge, which is so dysfunctional that they need to resort to constant purging of anyone who doesn't fit their criteria, right? And so I think we have to be careful of legitimate critiques of like the ethnic system that we have, but just occupying the enemy's stereotype of us and sort of reverting into like base populism is not the way forwards, and that's something Moldbug says, and he's completely right. This is not a reactionary phenomenon to immediately start all alarms blazing when when there's some kind of like ethnic group in your society um, that isn't the same as yours. And just another thing that in the Russian Empire, as you mentioned, I think it was Alexander III who really implemented these Russification reforms. But all the time he was getting elites from Germany, from Ireland and England and France, and he was asking these people, look, he was giving them property and saying, look, develop this, use your European technology and your influence and your funds to develop this land here. And if we were to commit to a policy of pure ethnocentrism, we would lose this possibility of the sort of fruits of globalization. And of course, Russia, for the time being, managed to retain a sense of a traditional lifestyle, traditional culture and values, as well as not just shooting themselves in the foot by ignoring the possibilities of a greater expansion. And yeah, definitely.
Oh yeah, I think you did a pretty good job of critiquing the kind of the people who want this kind of ethno homogeneity. I mean, they're right to point out the kind of cynical way demographics are used, but the problem is that the only reason why demographics are the problem is because of this kind of democratic, the people's will rules all mentality.
Yeah, and you think that this should be sustainable. If people are just allowed to do what they want, they will just form communities with who they want and continue that, and self-determine within this kind of under the kingship or rulership of a sovereign authority. This is entirely possible. And this is basically what happened in America before the Civil Rights Act, which enforced segregation. And regardless of what you think about that, whether it was a good or a bad thing or whatever, most people living in those communities did not want that, and they simply they weren't like, and there was obviously problems with racial tension, but a society that just guarantees the freedom for people to associate with whom they want to is just completely, I mean, that's just the best way of managing it, right? Managing these ethnic potential ethnic tensions. Enforcing integration is not sustainable because it's proximity and diversity which is problematic. I had some point, but I forgot what I was going to say.
Oh yeah, I think that's a pretty sensible position that you have. One of I guess one last thing that I would say is, so what's another critique that you had for Endeavour with regards to his video?
Well, he kind of had this bizarre point about neocameralism and running society like a corporation is what we have now with like woke capital. But this is not a correct like comparison, because what we have now is not society run by a sovereign authority like a company is structured. Instead, we have a kind of like decaying corpse of a government in the US, which is preyed upon by these companies who do not care for the common good like someone in charge of a society would be. And they simply are engaged in a race to the bottom in terms of principles, in which everything that doesn't encourage the reduction of a person, the demeaning of a person into the ideal consumer unit is abandoned. So, what we have today is not at all what Moldbug intended when he wrote about sort of a patchwork of sovereign corporations, right? I mean, that's just not the same thing at all. So that comment really surprised me, and I thought it was, worthy of a critique. And that's why I made the video, because I really want Endeavour to expand on some of the points that he made, because I just felt like I couldn't believe quite what I was hearing.
I see. So I've talked to Endeavour in private about this in his video, and he feels that the main reason and we talked about the clear pill, and the main reason he's against the clear pill, he says, is that the only path to power that he sees is populist revolt, and that anything else is and that there is no other option if we want to change things. What would you have to say to that?
Well, that's basically fascism, right? I think that it's not possible. I think that generally we can take lessons from groups who have, lost connections with their homeland and who do not have a sovereign territory that they, as a group, they have, somewhat of control over, like the Jews, and and yeah, I don't know. I mean, solutions are one of the hardest things, right? Because to make predictions, your model of the world has to be very accurate, and there is almost nothing that will allow you to predict the state of politics in terms of, strife and civil conflict. But I think that a committed group of people who makes networks, institutions, their own payment processes, allocates funds towards this shared project will be able to produce something constructive. Now, there is a problem in that basically everyone has every incentive to defect. There is more money in the kind of leftist politics. You can get a better job if you don't engage with, reactionary people, reactionary societies. Sending in your commitment to diversity and inclusion, like block on your CV, is required now in certain occupations. So you will gain almost nothing from choosing to promote, the kind of standards and the policies that we want. And of course, there is no political solution. I mean, that's not like a Fed post, like a dog whistle, but that's just a fact, right? Within our sphere of politics, it's only possible to deteriorate further.
I mean, there is no political solution includes the kind of violence that you'd see some people dog whistling about, or is stealthily trying to implement. People like, I mean, here's the thing, right? If you don't have if you don't have a big enough group to be a sizable voting bloc, then you're not going to have a big enough group to run an army. That's one thing. Another thing is, just like, I mean, if we take the maxim that politics is just war by another means seriously, then I don't think that an armed uprising by the based people is going to be any more effective than if the based people go into a democratic arena, because essentially what you're doing is because it's essentially the same problems that apply to trying to engage democratically is this apply to trying to engage violently, which is you don't have the money, you don't have the organization, you don't have the leaders, you don't have the men, you don't have discipline, etc. Those kinds of problems plague these groups. And you mentioned before about the other side having money and power on their side. I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of neo-reactionaries or dissident right people, they're not very sociable people generally. A lot of them
I know what you mean.
a lot of them have that kind of contrarian personality. In fact, I had one friend of mine who once said that if they were if most of these people had grown up in the kinds of societies that they say that they're advocating for, they would have grown up to be frothing at the mouth communists.
Yep, I basically agree with that entirely.
because like a lot of them are just motivated by, well, I just want to oppose the social order as it exists. And the paradox of that is we live in a society in which the socially acceptable views are antisocial and anti-civilizational, leading to these kinds of strange outcomes that we see, hence clown world.
Okay, well, definitely there is a breach between the traditional like conservative voter base and neo-reactionaries. But here's the thing: when you read Moldbug and you really inquire into these historical topics, you begin to realize that a lot of the time the kind of conservatives were basically right about a lot of what happened. And of course, that you can come to that rationally as just an unbiased, like reader of literature. But there is something to be said that the neo-reactionary is kind of autistic, right? I mean, they're not like they usually, like, Moldberg is a prime example. Complete Silicon Valley elites, not elites, but like programming nerdy libertarian types who just like happened to read Patriarcha by Robert Filmer instead of Chomsky or something like that. So the personality type is not one that would be swept up in a kind of populist fervor against the government. It's much more trusting, perhaps more naive, more intellectual, but basically kind of in the opposite direction. Took an honest look at the literature and came to their own conclusions. But that's just I don't know, our side of the internet's quirk, I guess.
Definitely. And I honestly think that you're not going to get that. I honestly think that there's not a path to power at this moment, and we ought to focus on trying to go in for the long haul, so to speak. I think that's where I would disagree in a praxeological sense with other members of the dissident right. And I think that, I've really soured on the idea of democracy and things. I'm not a monarchist myself, but I'm always open to alternatives to the kind of will of the people style of politics, because quite frankly I think it's sort of I think it's just nothing but a bunch of dead ends splitting off into different directions.
I agree. I mean, I liked Moldbug's comparison of Western liberalism to communism in the end of the Cold War. Right? It just like at one point just ceases to really be effective, and everyone thinks we'll have something else. We'll have Western whatever, like Western influence instead. I think basically people are quite confused because it looks like things are constantly getting worse, but in fact things are already really bad. They just haven't unraveled and revealed it's like the way it is to us. So I think that people cling on to some kind of hope that that there is this like power leak, perhaps there is some potential for us to make a change. In reality, it's like about as unlikely as like a fascist in communist Russia for this to happen. We just have to wait for the internal contradictions of the current system to play themselves out to the extent that basically anyone who is anyone sees it for what it is, and that's when we have a restoration or something better. And I think that's honestly the best way to do it. Unless you believe like that in the next 50 years we're all going to be inundated with like chemicals in our water that's going to turn us into like mush, genderless, whatever, people incapable of like revolting against anything. But everything that's like that has to die eventually, right? Any kind of utterly dysfunctional government that has to destroy its own people in order to stay in power will either be conquered or will fall apart. We just have to hope that like China's not as bad as our current government, right? But we'll see. We'll see. Making predictions is like not is it like kind of fruitless of an exercise. We just have to ensure stringency, and that we proactively engage with people like us who want to create networks and our vision of the future. No purity spiraling, just solidifying like institutions that we can congregate around, and just hold out, because there is no way that we can win currently with the firepower that we had. As you said, like war as a politics as a proxy for war. We're on the losing side at the moment, so it's just a matter of waiting for the chaos to eat itself, as I kind of said like in my video. If progress is like a cancer cell, just wait till it like consumes itself as something more to feed on, and then it perhaps will just fall apart, fingers crossed, before we're conquered by some alien superpower or something like that, if we can get back on our feet. But that's thinking way too far ahead. So at the moment, just take the clear pill.
What I would say is, I think one would bring up, and this is my last critique of Moldbug and NRX and things like that. So I've been thinking about this for a while, and when you look at Moldbug, a lot of his best ideas come from people like Vilfredo Pareto and the kind of Machiavellian thinkers. And Moldbug's entire analysis seems to have this kind of realist edge, realist in as in the school of international relations. And realism is actually very popular in the academy. It's actually one of the most popular. It's one of the most popular, substantial school in the academy, and it really gets me thinking. Like, if you're not going to advocate for this kind of neo-monarchism that Moldbug has, and you're just using his kind of power analysis of the current system, why would you identify as a neo-reactionary? Why wouldn't you just call yourself a realist?
Because nomenclature is important to signify group identity, right? It's like it's cool, and Moldbug talks about wearing tweed as a signifier of your kind of it's like a winking about your intellectual roots, or how you perceive the world in terms of politics. So I think that this is something that Endeavour said on Twitter. The cathedral was too alien to normies. They won't pick it up. They won't care about it. It's not like useful. But I would disagree. I think that if we have our own sort of standards, model of language, that's important to signify who we are and what we advocate for. Obviously, I don't think that's practical necessarily, because of course no one wants to reveal themselves as neo-reactionary. Calling yourself a realist in terms of academia is much more fruitful for your career, right? That's probably the main reason.
Well, it's not just in terms of your career. It's in terms of, like, do you want police to be knocking on or for being associated with the because you're and not associating with the wrong types of people on the internet?
Yeah, that too.
I mean, that's I've had the reason I'm bringing this up is that I've talked to people who've had that happen to them. They were in these circles, and the police came knocking on their doors saying, "Hey, you're not. Hey, we're concerned about you because you're associating with these evil, not something fascist groups, blah blah blah, and that spooks them. So the thing is, if you're not going, the only reason you'd call yourself a reactionary, in my opinion, is if you actually believed in something that's really reactionary. Like if you're calling yourself a reactionary, but you don't really want the monarchism, or you don't really want the monarchism, and you're only doing it to be like an edgy boy. I don't think I think there's there's an element of dishonesty in there. I think there's an element of the kind of a LARP in there, where you're just trying. It seems like bad faith,
Yeah, no LARPing. I mean, that's just, you can't have it.
Yeah, I think you seem like the kind of guy who you're actually sympathetic to the ideas of monarchism, and you'd probably advocate for more. Your ideal system would probably be more of an absolutist variety, if I'm not correct.
Yeah, well, Thomas Wentworth said, "The king is the keystone which closeth up the arch of order and government." So that is like my, kind of internet persona, like motto, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, that's not bad faith for you because you actually do believe that. But if you can't call yourself NRX if you're not going to actually have reactionary views. If you just like Moldbug's analysis of progressivism, all of that can be found within. All of that is just kind of a synthesis of his reading of history combined with a kind of Machiavellian view of politics. And
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
yeah, completely. I mean, if we're talking about Endeavour here, it's just, I listened to the video that he made, and it was like he disagrees with Moldbug's theory of the genealogy of progressivism, of Puritanism to progressivism. He disagrees with the nature of the cathedral. The how is correct, but the why isn't. If you think that there were no like progressive idealists in America before 1944, 1945, you have to read your history. I mean, Walden, Henry David Thoreau, these like individuals were seriously pushing this stuff way before any foreign ethnic influence, and disagreeing with like neo-cameralism. So it's just like, what's NRX here? I mean, is it just you're a reactionary? I mean, anti-enlightenment, that's fine. There are, bad criticisms there, but that's not NRX necessarily. So yeah, I think that just precision in our terms is important, right? You can't just call yourself neo-reactionary and then disagree with like the main tenets of the theory. That just doesn't make any sense to me. So that was the main reason. Not that Endeavour's arguments have no merit, because of course they do. There's a lot to be said for critiques of neo-cameralism. I'm not a neo-cameralist. I wouldn't say I was. The de-emphasizing of Jewish influence on progressivism. I mean, that needs to be talked about. But like, there are better like signifiers to represent what you believe than neo-reactionary, especially for someone like him. Sorry, I'm a bit scattered. But my main point is just like, I really want him to clarify his position on these issues, because it's not clear to me that anything that he says is really compatible with the way that he represents himself.
All right. I think that's a pretty good. I think that's a pretty good idea. That I think that really that's a really good point, and I think that really is a good end, capstone to our discussion. I think that I think you've made your point here. I think we could both agree that the kind of NRX view, there's a lot of there are a lot of problems with it at the moment, but at the same time there are some there is some gold in here that we can take and use for ourselves, and we can understand. And if we're being being philosophical, if we're if we're seeking truth, no matter where it is, I think this is a good place to find. I think some of the NRX stuff is a good place to find truth. I think there are unique points that Moldbug makes that, while they might be found in older authors, he's the one introducing these older authors. And so I think there, even if you aren't identifying as NRX, there's some value to them.
Yeah, definitely. There is one thing which I will concede to Endeavour, and that is Modbug solutions are trash. I mean, seriously, cryptographic weapon locks. I mean, how does that even work? And I mean, like the kind of CEO and shareholder relationship. I mean, the average CEO is replaced once every 6.8 years. So if you're trying to implement like a kind of ordered government, like a sort of Hoppian variety that will think in terms of a lower time preference, think into the future, having a CEO as the head of your society is not going to do that when they're accountable to this board of shareholders, right? So I completely agree with Endeavour. Solutions, bit iffy on those, but generally, yeah, that's my criticism.
Definitely. All right. So I think we've just about. I'm glad we were able to settle this, and I'm glad that I had you on. And Tom, I think your future as a YouTuber is looking pretty bright. What do you have in store for us?
I plan to do a sort of dissection of the history of progress in terms of a motivating political philosophy in the USA. I think there's a lot of confusion about that. I'd like to clarify some things, especially the NRX perspective, because as we mentioned, the Protestant to progressive pipeline is like ambiguous and contested. And I would also like to do a history of the cathedral, so providing like a buttressing argument, some historical context in the ways that the universities, the organs of propaganda, and as we know it, right, propaganda, truth, quote unquote, in American society has been disseminated and has been connected with government, because I think that that's often quite confusing, and that's one of the key aspects of neo-reactionary theory. So yeah, that's what I'm planning. So if you are interested in that, then subscribe to my channel, and I'll hopefully have it done in due time.
Glad to hear it. All right. Well, guys, I just want to mention a few things. I'm going to be having an interview with 21st Reaction on his channel. It'll be an edited interview, so be on the lookout for that. And I'm also going to be having an interview with Renaissance Man at the end of the month. I hope to have that down. And finally, I'm trying to write up this my next response video to Louis Levi on classical liberalism and sort of the technical problems with the anti-SJW position. So I think that I think that you'll find something in there for you guys to learn, and I hope that you all enjoy those upcoming videos. This is Mr. Geocon, and I'm signing out. Thank you for watching.
Thank you for having me on your show.